Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jimmy Kemp. I'm president of the Jack Kemp Foundation. We've been around for about 9 years. And we have a very international audience today, which makes a lot of sense. I'm going to start off with a quick explanation of who Jack Kemp was. And many people in the United States remember him mostly for being an NFL quarterback for 13 years for the Buffalo Bills, most of that time in the 1960s. After he had a sufficient number of concussions, he decided that it was appropriate to run for the United States Congress. And so in 1970, my dad was elected to Congress from just outside of Buffalo, New York, served in Congress for 18 years until he ran for president in 1988, unsuccessfully, losing to George H.W. Bush in the primary. And President-elect Bush, asked my dad to become Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, where he served for 4 years. And then he went into what he called his political wilderness in the early 90s. And he was very surprised to receive a call from an old foe, a friendly foe, but Bob Dole asked my father to be his vice presidential nominee in 1996, which was a surprise. I happened to be playing football in the Canadian Football League at the time, and a buddy of mine told me, "Hey, Jimmy, your dad's the vice presidential nominee." I said, "Don't worry about it." He and Senator Dole didn't like each other. They don't like each other. And I said, "I think you might want to come check this out." And sure enough, my parents, they didn't need to consult me. Why would they? I was a 24-year-old punk. But they'd gone on and said yes. And not only did it surprise the U.S. media, but us family members didn't know either. After that, my dad had Empower America. He and I had a business called Kemp Partners together. And when he passed away in 2009, I was really fortunate and privileged to start a foundation in his name, which exists today. Today we're having a Kemp Forum on global economic growth. Our Kemp Forum series is a debate and discussion series that provides a platform for the civil competition of ideas. David, I hope you and Steve can please be civil today. But isn't that what our country needs? We need people talking about ideas, thinking about the way that reality works. And today, talking about global economic growth, thinking about the way that business is transacted instantaneously and what the parameters for that business are. How do countries set their financial policies, their monetary policies, so that people can become all that God created them to be? The Jack Kemp Foundation's mission is to advance the American idea, and we cover economic policy, foreign policy, and equality of opportunity are the 3 areas on which we focus, taken from my dad and his career, inspired by him. So today, if you are interested in what we're talking about and want to have that social media conversation that apparently is pretty not persuasive, that is pervasive. That's the word I was looking for. Use hashtag Kemp Forum to be a part of the conversation. And one thing that I do want to note about my dad, a lot of people knew him for his football career as a quarterback, but supply-side economics is what he was known for in his political career. He was not a great politician because he knew how to work Washington. He was a great politician because he believed in the American idea and he believed in the substance that became supply-side economics. Supply-side economics, known as the combination of getting tax rates right, getting them at the right level to maximize incentives, and having tighter monetary policy than was had at the time in the 70s, which is what helped end the stagflation of the 70s. And it was Dad's Kemp-Roth tax bill that President Reagan signed into law in 1981 that really launched Dad's political career and helped people to take a physical education major from Occidental College who played football seriously in the economic realm. And a quote from him on this topic. My father in 1982 said that what is too little recognized is the fact that the pressure for protectionism more often than not originates in a failure of the monetary system. A common and increasingly integrated market requires a common medium of exchange. Therefore, monetary disorders manifest themselves as disruptions of trade. Not bad for a quarterback who had had some concussions. And in the 80s, to focus attention on a more stable monetary system, Dad looked around and he realized that there were a lot of people who'd written great stuff on this. One of them was future Nobel laureate Dr. Robert Mundell. And he also realized that politically, to get anything done, you had to be able to engage with folks on the other side. So Dad went to a Democratic senator from New Jersey who also happened to be an athlete, Senator Bill Bradley, and they convened conferences talking about monetary policy and international monetary policy that laid the groundwork for the Plaza Accord of 1985 and the Louvre Accord of 1987, which focused on stabilizing the system. Those accords made important contributions, and today, given the financial instability that we've seen in recent years, we think it may be time for such consideration of a new exchange rate accord. So last year at the Jack Kemp Foundation, as part of our Kemp Forum series, we started the Project on Exchange Rates and the Dollar. It's directed by Sean Rushton, who's standing in the back, and if you don't know Sean, please make sure that you introduce yourself. And Sean, thank you for being the inspiration behind this and taking the inspiration that you got from Mundell and Kemp and doing this. And to honor Dr. Mundell, I'd like to read a quote from him as well. At our first event last year, Dr. Mundell sent us a letter and said the following: there is no valid economic argument in favor of global monetary disarray. The multiple and major currency shifts that take place every year serve to exacerbate trade tensions and spawn protectionism. Exchange rate instability does not provide any kind of positive adjustment in the world. It is just turbulence and waste. It condemns the world to sluggish economic growth, which contributes to rising political stresses. And without fundamental reform, I fear continued long-term trade imbalances and financial crises will lead to very negative outcomes. Dr. Mundell, we believe, knew what he was talking about. These themes of the need to remove barriers to economic production while at the same time maintaining a stable unit of account, both at home and internationally, were central to the Kemp economic philosophy. And Dad, as I mentioned, he looked for people who were great thinkers on the issues that he believed were central to the human flourishing that America should represent. So some years ago, I assume it was in the 80s, David, my dad met David Malpass, and they became friends, and Dad asked David, he probably didn't ask him, he just said, hey, David, I'm gonna be calling on you. And David's phone rang often, and I think he learned that he needed to respond quickly or else that phone would keep on ringing. We at the Kemp Foundation are thrilled with David's appointment. His wife Adele is a wonderful partner for him. We're grateful for the Malpass family. And David's the right man at the right time for this job. So I'm glad that you all who are here today have the opportunity to get to hear from him and meet him as well. And then finally, we're really happy to have Dr. Steve Hanke with us here. When you think, and I know everybody thinks about this when they wake up in the morning, when you think about hyperinflation, Steve Hanke is the man. Looking around the globe at where instability is rising and measuring the hyperinflation that can grip a country and shake it to its core, it's a problem that a lot of people unfortunately aren't thinking about, a lot of economists aren't thinking about, but Steve is, and he's advising nations that want to end or prevent that hyperinflation. Steve's a professor of applied economics and the co-director of the Institute for Applied Economics and Global Health and the Study of Business Enterprise at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He's also senior fellow and director of the Troubled Currencies Project at the Cato Institute, a senior advisor at the Renmin University of China's International Monetary Research Institute in Beijing, a special counselor to the Center for Financial Stability in New York, a contributing editor at Central Banking in London, and a contributor at Forbes. He's been a key ally to us at this project, and Steve is going to be very involved in today's program. Steve, please come up and share some remarks with us. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Jimmy. Don't worry, I'll be rather brief in my presentation, and right after that I'll introduce Undersecretary Malpass. David and I go back probably even further than your dad and David go back. But in any case, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to make 3 PowerPoint presentations. So there'll be 3 brief PowerPoints. The first one is supply-side economics. And supply-side economics, people still wonder, well, what's that? Lowering taxes, yeah, that's part of supply-side economics. But fundamentally, it's minding your P's more than your Q's. That is, prices rather than quantities. And if we go back to the start of the crisis that we begin actually in August of 2007, that's where I want to begin. And that crisis started bubbling up, remember, in August of 2007 in the United States with the subprime mortgage fiasco. It also, more pointedly, blossomed in the UK when Northern Rock, a savings and loan institution, went under. The first bank run that they'd had, I think, in a century in the UK. Northern Rock folded in 2007. Then we had, as David well remembers, March of 2007, Bear Stearns was taken over by JP Morgan, and AIG got into trouble and so forth. And then the big one came, and that's September 15th, 2008, we had Lehman go down. And to understand the Lehman going down bit, you have this ramp up of all these problems coming, but the P's are very important and the supply side economics part of the story. So I will go, if I can run this properly, to the first slide. And this is talking about P's. This is all P's. The most important P in the world, that is price, is the euro-dollar exchange rate. That's the most important price. And what was happening from July through November is really quite dramatic. If you look at the appreciation in the third column, the appreciation of the US dollar against the euro in 3 short months, it appreciated by over 20%, a fantastic price move in the most important price in the world. That important price, by the way, was not on the dashboard of anyone at the Fed in the higher ranks, meaning the chairman. It was not on the chairman's dashboard. But it's on the supply side dashboard. So we had the collapse of the euro. We had a sharp appreciation in the dollar, a collapse in the price of gold. That's another price. The price of oil, you can see we had a tremendous decline, almost 60%. And almost instantly, the consumer price index, it was 5.6% in July, and it went down to 1.1%, a 4.5 percentage point drop, a huge collapse. By the time we got into the summer of 2009, actually the economy was registering negative on the CPI index. We were actually deflating. Now, the point here is, in the supply side view of things, focusing on prices is what? The monetary policy in the United States, at the time these problems were developing and Lehman was getting tightly boxed into a corner, was way too tight. We had a huge appreciation of the US dollar. The dollar was soaring at this time, suggesting that monetary policy was too tight. So if we go to the second slide, how do we fix this? Well, we fix it. The second slide I like to call my Palazzo Mundell slide, because Bob Mundell has a group of friends and associates visit him every summer at his palazzo outside of Siena, and the group, usual suspects, including former central bankers such as Paul Volcker, is a steadfast member of the group, talking about stability. Now, stability might not be everything, but everything is nothing without stability in general, and particularly with regard to exchange rates. So here you go, up at the top, you can see that peak way up there when the dollar was very weak, and then we had the summer of 2008 where the thing appreciates massively and comes down. That was the big move on the first slide that I had. It's out of this range of 120 to 140. The US dollar, when it's above 140, is obviously very weak, and when it's below, it's extremely strong, and the euro's weak. Our proposal at Mundell's is that we should have some arrangement between the United States and the Europeans to stabilize the exchange rate, the most important price in the world, the dollar-euro exchange rate. And if that was stable, all the other satellites would tend to stabilize around it because they're very much focused on that important price. So when the dollar is weak, when it's above 140 on that chart, how does it get stabilized? The ECB would buy the dollar, and if they were buying the dollar, that means they're increasing their monetary base, so they'd loosen up their monetary policy. And on the other side, if the dollar is, the euro is very weak and the dollar is very strong, if you're down below 120 on this, the Fed actually would defend the euro, purchasing euros, and of course increasing the monetary base in the United States as a result, loosening up. And the relative values and monetary stance would be stable in Europe and the United States, which we're talking about a big chunk of the world economy, if in fact they followed some sort of rule or had some kind of agreement along those lines. Now, in this regard, it is interesting, our featured speaker of the day, if you look back to his scholarly work, including an article in the 2005 issue of the Cato Journal, had this to say: clearly, a stable currency, not a strong or weak, is appropriate during most of a country's economic life. So I'm going to introduce David in a minute. We're very much on the same page. And as you can see, this idea of stability in general is recognized by people in the supply side camp in the economic sphere. Now, the last slide is, well, why does anyone care about stable money? Or do companies care about stable money? I had two of my research assistants spend the better part of a semester reading every annual report of the top 100 companies in the United States. And they wanted to see, one, did they say anything about exchange rates or exchange rate risk, exchange rate exposure? And as you can see, every single company in these three groups that I have, yes, they noted exposure to foreign exchange risk, and it was of concern to them. The second item down here, did the company hedge its risk? As you can see, 77% of the 77 companies are in the column 1. So that means 77% in that group, representing that group, did hedge. And also in the third row down there, you can see that that group was hedging too. There were 20 companies in there. So you had 97% of all the top 100 companies actually were not only concerned, but also hedging their risk. Now, the last item, did they quantify the foreign exchange losses? The first group, you had 77, they did quantify, they gave you a number. The second group also quantified, and they did not hedge. There were only 3 companies out of the top 100 that did not hedge, but they did report their losses. In the third group, they were concerned, they hedged, and they did not report their losses. So what kind of losses are we talking about? In 2016, you had Microsoft, the FX lost $3.3 billion. Alphabet lost $1 billion in foreign exchange. Procter & Gamble, $880 million. So you're talking about real money here. So concern, action, in most cases hedging, still losses, and the losses are quite large. And with that, I will terminate my slide presentation and get to a more pleasurable thing, and that is introducing my good friend, Undersecretary David Malpass, to you. Now, David is been around, and he's not only been around, he's very respected on Wall Street, where he was at Bear Stearns as the chief economist, and also had his own independent consultancy, and very well respected in Wall Street. He's been in Washington on various tours of duty. George Bush #1, U.S. Secretary, U.S. Treasury Department, Assistant Secretary. Prior to that, Ronald Reagan. That was my first encounter with David in the political sphere, U.S. Treasury. Also, the chief of staff on the Republican staff for the Joint Economic Committee. So he's been on the Hill, he's been in U.S. Treasury 2 times around, he's been on Wall Street in a number of positions. And I think the main thing about David that I like is the fact that he thinks and he writes. So if you go back and look at the Wall Street Journal, you'll find many articles that David penned. I quoted one out of the Cato Journal. So he's a thinker and he's a writer. He's a Kempite in that sense. He likes ideas and likes the action both in Wall Street and Washington. So with that, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I'm very happy to be here at the Jack Kemp Foundation. I want to thank Jimmy Kemp and Sean Rushton for putting this together. Also, Steve Hanke for the very kind introduction, and warm regards to Joanne Kemp. I watched Lindsey Vonn run the downhill yesterday, and I thought of Joanne and Jack bombing down the ski slopes where they were excellent skiers. And so I wanted to answer the question of when did I first meet Jack. That was in 1984. It was a House-Senate budget conference, and he was persistent, tenacious in fighting for ideas. I went to Mount Vernon on Monday during President's Day, took my family there, and we can all remember, and here we are in a historic building here, those are historic buildings there, on how powerful our country's foundation is in fighting for ideas. So I want to talk today about peace through strength. That's one of our strongest ideas. How do we create peace by having a strong economy. And the Trump administration's high priority is on growth, both here and abroad, as a way to make us stronger and to create a good environment for people, for higher median incomes. We need a strong economy that provides sufficient resources for the national security. That's been a priority in the new budget. So we're sparking the growth side of that equation through a tax reform law that will improve the structure of the economy, along with regulatory reform, energy reform, and trade reform. The policies are aimed at allowing new businesses to form and small businesses to grow. This sounds a little like Jack Kemp. The goal is to achieve higher median incomes, that means more pay for workers, for more workers, and to reverse the policies of weakness and decline that prevailed over the last decade. The Council of Economic Advisors will be releasing a great new report today on these growth policies. It's coming out, I think, this afternoon. It's chock full of chapters about how do you grow an economy, 700 pages worth, and I commend it to you. Tax reform is one of the critical reforms discussed in the report, so I want to go into that a little bit. I was inspired by Jack Kemp in 1984, 1985 to become the senior tax analyst at the Senate Budget Committee, and then I transferred to the Treasury Department in 1986 to work on the Tax Act of 1986, which was very important in sparking U.S. growth. I then later worked for the Joint Economic Committee, but you know who was the ranking member then? Bill Roth. So Bill Roth insisted on it being called the Roth-Kemp tax bill. And so I was schooled in the importance of taxes and growth from the very beginning. Many forecasting models lowball the longer-term growth effect of the new tax law by focusing on its fiscal mechanisms rather than the structural change. So economists want to create models that look at deficits as being the source of growth, when in reality, the real-world effect of tax cuts come from businesses, large and small, responding to improvements in growth policies, including regulatory, tax, and energy reforms as we're undertaking now. So the tax bill that just passed in December lowered the corporate rate to 21%. That aligns incentives so that managers focus more on creating profitable businesses and building their labor pool rather than offshoring jobs and devising expensive financial structures to minimize taxes. Importantly, the new law will benefit many unincorporated businesses dear to Jack's heart. They are often the nimblest and best able to hire and train workers new to their industry. Precisely the workers President Trump wants to draw into the labor force. The new law provides small pass-through businesses with a 20% tax deduction, helping them compete with big companies and government-dominated industries. The tax law encourages U.S. business investment, allows a better allocation of capital, and encourages small business dynamism. This combination of structural improvements will draw more workers into the labor force, improving their skills. This will allow the economy to build from the low average growth rate that preceded the Trump administration. Measures of business investment, business confidence, hiring intentions, and profit expectations are all up sharply, and I expect new business formation to begin to rise from the deep trough of recent years as a result of the combination of structural reforms in the new economic program. I want to turn now to the international front, where I spend most of my time nowadays. We're creating an environment that will encourage growth abroad and help growth in the United States by balancing and creating growth opportunities and investment opportunities. First in this is redirecting our China policy. Trade and investment should be reciprocal. China stopped liberalizing, so they were on a trend that would have brought them more and more toward market economies, but they seem to have stalled in that and even reversed in that policy. The White House's national security strategy guides a new direction on China that will insist on reciprocity in terms of trade and investment as a key step in creating a more growth-oriented environment for the US and for other countries. And there's been broad consensus outside China, around the world, that it's critical, it's important for the world to recognize China's reversal in its liberalization trend and to begin to take steps that will allow our own growth to continue in spite of that change of trend. We need also to find solutions that counter the mission creep that controls international organizations. When you work on the international side of government, as I do now and have in some past parts of my career, you find that there's a giant sprawl as big on the international side as it is on the domestic side. A host of organizations are creating mountains of debt without solving problems. Huge organizations like the World Bank and the many multilateral development banks have created an environment where their own growth ends up being as important as their clients' growth. And I think that's a direction that we can and have to change in order to foster global growth. In short, multilateralism has gone too far. We're working, in the administration are working with like-minded countries to focus the missions of the G20, the group of 20 countries, the G7, the Financial Stability Board, which is a giant regulatory oversight organization, the OECD, and so on, in order to focus their missions so that they're more amenable to rising median incomes in the US and for American workers. China itself is lending like crazy to poor countries, trying to buy friends and exports, but often sustaining weak governments and leaving poor people with loads of debt. Venezuela is a case in point. In the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela is China's biggest investment and biggest set of credits, meaning they owe China the most amount of money in the Western Hemisphere. The IMF's Christine Lagarde said over the weekend that the US tax cut was creating a race to the bottom by choosing tax policies that might cause governments to cause a reduction in government spending. The best way to reduce the dependence on government is to allow the private sector to grow, and you can't do that through taxes or devaluations. Trade renegotiations that work for Americans are also critical in our international approach. NAFTA, KORUS, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, need to be renegotiated in a way that benefits American workers and that creates a win-win situation so that we can grow our own economy as well as growth abroad. I want to also mention dependable money, one of our topics today. The IMFC communique that was issued in October, and then the APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Finance Ministerial Statement that was issued in November, both included statements noting the importance of exchange rate stability as a goal of sound policies and as a contributor to strong and sustainable growth and investment. I'll quote from the communique, strong fundamentals, sound policies, and a resilient international monetary system are essential to the stability of exchange rates, contributing to strong and sustainable growth and investment. One final area I want to mention is we're laying out an innovative set of Western Hemisphere initiatives. This year is the Year of the Americas, with Argentina, Peru, and Canada all hosting summits. We support freedom, democracy, free and fair elections, and we have a goal that this year, 2018, be a year when all of the people of Latin America and the Western Hemisphere could live in freedom and democracy Venezuela and Cuba are not in that condition at present. Stronger policies abroad would allow higher median incomes abroad and at home in the United States. That benefits us all, and that's part of our policy on Latin America. I gave a speech at the CSIS and described a 10-point plan called America Crece, or America's Grow, that encourages reciprocal trade and investment, especially in energy, that will allow all of the peoples of the Western Hemisphere to have faster growth in median income. So in conclusion, growth isn't rocket science. It comes from liberal markets, hard work, dependable money, the rule of law, democracy, good ideas, lots of leadership. In short, peace through strength. And I want to stop with that and see if we have discussion and participation. Thank you. Here?
David and I'll start the conversation and then open it up for Q&A as we segue into the audience. I think, David, maybe as we start, do you have any reflections on specific anecdotes, for example, about Jack Kemp and Roth and how they operated to get something actually done? Because they got a lot of big things done, or at least one big thing.
They did. You know, I think core ideas are really important. So they had a core idea that growth can be faster, that you can achieve that mostly through private sector growth. So you start from that, and then I think you add persistence. And so pushing all the time for a core principle was critical to it. That gets in, of course, that gets into economics. So you can think about lower tax rates on a broader base being a critical part as we think about the current corporate rate having moved from 35% to 21%. That sparks a whole range of improvement in behavior by companies, not only in the US, but really around the world. Because when you have one rate that sticks out and is too high, it causes distortions. So those kinds of ideas are exactly what they talked about. I was in Senator Roth's office when he began thinking about what became the Roth IRA. And so the idea was, how do you help people save money? The Roth IRA is a powerful tool to do that. He heard about the idea, thought about the idea, and adopted it right away. It took 10 years for that to become law. He had to first become the Finance Committee chairman, which he wasn't, and that gave him a position of enough power to begin putting forward an idea. And then year after year, he pushed for that kind of law. So I guess the lesson is, have some good ideas, have them be synchronous with good principles, and then push for them.
And the one thing I'd be curious about, both Kemp and Roth leaned on heavy-duty intellectuals and were very much interacting with people like Mundell, for example, and a whole host of people that were associated with the Wall Street Journal at the time. I mean, Bob Bartley and Wininski and all of these people were intellectual / journalist or almost pure academics. You have any?
Well, and we still have a lot of challenges today in the economic community as far as where does growth really originate. And so I think holding to that principle that it originates in a rule of law applied to a private sector that has freedom is core to that view. That's a battle that we really need to fight, I think, every day.
Now, moving into the contemporary scene, I mean, we've got the slogan "America First." How does the thinking of supply side economics, I mean, going back to kind of your origin and the way you think about things, how does it really fit in. I know you were outlining some of it in your speech, but could you maybe elaborate just a little bit on that?
Thanks, yeah, and I've talked about it in previous speeches in more detail, but what has happened over the recent decades is multilateral institutions, and the candidate Trump talked about globalism, not globalization. You know, people swap the two terms. So globalization can mean a supply chain that creates efficient production around the world if there is a fair basis within trade agreements for doing that. Globalism is often the governments working together for the benefit really of people at the upper end of the scale to make government bigger and have it grow more than the private sector actually grows, which if we look back has been part of the problem in the slow world growth that we've seen in recent years. So I describe it as multilateralism gone too far. And I emphasize in speeches that the Trump administration is thoroughly engaged and wants to be engaged in world affairs, in leadership, in helping other countries and seeing growth go faster around the world. But that's separate from whether governments do that. That means that we want private sectors around the world. That means free people working together in market pricing in order to create more jobs. And so that really ends up being the goal of the policies.
Yeah, staying on the international thing now, one thing that Jack Kemp was big on, I can't remember ever being at a meeting with Jack where he didn't mention the fact that the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 was one of the major contributing factors to the Great Depression. And now I'm reading in the paper the administration is threatening to put on tariffs on aluminum and steel, for example. So how do we kind of square this? Just to preface, because you remember this.
Well, I don't want to go too far in that, but I will explain. So as we view the situation in the U.S. for workers at the median level, the workers in many states were feeling the pressure of unfair trade practices abroad, some of which came about from free trade agreements that were struck at times and then not implemented. If we think about China, for example, it liberalized into the world until the point that it got into the World Trade Organization. That organization doesn't really have the strength to stand up to China's subsidized industrial policy, which is an explicit set of goals to take over global manufacturing sectors as well as services sectors. So that went forward into an agreement that many countries entered into thinking that they had a deal that China would continue that trend. And then that backed off. And so we ended up with a situation in the US where many of the industries simply moved away, offshoring of jobs. And so the point that we're at now is the need for a renegotiation of some of the previous trade agreements, and then also a set of responses to what China is doing, which is patently non-market behavior. And I think that should be an inclusive kind of goal for the world, for a world that's headed or that desires more freedom for its people and more market orientation. And what we find is that other countries are very much seeing similar, their perception of what's going on in China is similar to what we're seeing. We saw recently President Macron of France go to China, this was about a month ago, and come back saying he needed to reorient France's policy with regard to China. We saw Prime Minister Theresa May of the UK go to China in the last couple of weeks and come back to the UK with the view that China's policies were not moving in the direction that they had thought they were moving. And so that's a global view that I think should be welcome and, by the US, that there's a perception that the policies that were in place were not working, and that new direction is going to work better from the standpoint of American workers and of global growth. And we're seeing it in the business community picking up its investment levels. World growth is already beginning to accelerate from the very low levels that had been suffered in 2012, 13, and 14.
Yeah, I think my big concern with that, reflecting back on the Reagan administration, when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, I spent most of my time fighting with colleagues over in effect, protectionist measures, in the spirit of renegotiating things, putting voluntary restraints. Remember then the Japanese cars were a big thing, and so. The kind of, shall we say, free trade people were primarily at Treasury, as you know, and the Council of Economic Advisors. At Commerce and some of the other elements in the Reagan administration, they basically won the day. And as Bill Niskanen concluded in his book reflecting on the Reagan years, we had the perfect rhetoric from the president with free trade, that's it. But the reality is...
I don't want to relitigate those years or those policies. So where we stand today is an observation that there are unfair trade practices in a lot of our trading partners and concentrated in some that can be addressed through better trade negotiations. And so that's where we stand, and it's a key part of world growth going forward, to find ways to make that work in an international trading environment that's based on freedom, that's based on, as I say, reciprocity. In China, we have allowed China to trade relatively freely with the US and invest relatively freely into the US, but there's not reciprocity on their side. Much more difficult for US businesses to try to compete and try to enter markets in China. Much harder for US businesses to sell into China. So it's a relationship that's not working. And so however you think about it in terms of the philosophy, doesn't really matter. What we're looking at is a way to have jobs for American workers based on fair relationships within a world marketplace.
Okay, you've obviously touched on China, just touched on China again, and the U.S. Would you like to say anything about Japan, for example, in the context of the international scene? Anything in particular? I know we have guests from Japan here, and they might be interested in any issues, any thoughts.
I'm happy to comment on quite a few countries and our own in terms of the benefit of structural reform in terms of growth. And so as Japan faces a competition from its neighbors, from around the world, from the United States, Japan, just like the US and other countries, needs to think about its own structural policies. The US has stepped forward with a major structural change in its tax policies, which will make us more competitive. And so in a recent Wall Street Journal article, I wrote how one hope for that is other countries then step up with structural reforms of their own. It would be in US interest to see other countries doing better policies. And Japan's policies, one that everyone's been aware of for a long time is their agricultural policies that don't really allow as much sale of goods into Japan as should happen. So Japanese people would benefit, and then that would spark innovation within Japan if there were structural reforms. But that applies to, we could go around Europe, we could go through Africa, through Latin America, of course, with individual policies that would allow people's incomes to go up relatively fast if they were able to make those reforms. and if I may, then one obstacle is how do you get those through governments? And one of the big challenges is governments want to resist that. They often like the status quo. They benefit from the status quo. It allows government to keep its own place within the society. So one of the big challenges, and both Jack Kemp and Bill Roth, Senator Bill Roth, recognized that within the U.S. economy, one of the biggest challenges was to deal with the government itself. And President Trump has been outspoken in the need to make changes that allow the government to improve so that the private sector can grow faster.
You have any other thoughts you want to conclude with before we open it to the floor?
Nope.
Because we have.
That sounds pretty good. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to take the questions, or you want me to do it? What would you prefer to have me to do?
Yeah, that'd be fine. However you want.
Okay, Peter.
Please.
Did you? Okay. Well. We've got a mic that's moving around.
All right. In light of recent market volatility, what policies would you recommend to the Federal Reserve to restore market interest rates without interrupting the emerging Trump boom?
Yeah, you know, the Fed is independent, and I'm not about to give them advice here. What I will say is that we are in a situation that's beneficial for private sector in terms of having capital relatively available. So a big challenge for government policy, broadly speaking, is how do you allow small businesses to have access to credit as they create a new business or as they want to grow. And that's something that people are working on every day as a way to find growth within the functioning of the financial system. Thanks.
Yes.
When Paul Volcker had your job in the...
Hold on a second. Can you just introduce yourself? So from now on, when you ask questions, please introduce yourself. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah. I'm Daniel Heath, the president of Maxwell Stamp Economics. When Paul Volcker had your job at the time of the Smithsonian Agreement on exchange rates in the 70s, he ran something called the C20, which was searching for alternatives to the present system. Have you plans for looking at alternatives to the present exchange rate regime?
No. So as I mentioned in my remarks, the IMFC communique in October described an environment where, and there's more context in that communique, where we welcome the relative stability of financial markets now, and that's beneficial for growth and investment. And so looking for ways to allow that those conditions that are relatively beneficial to continue and persist.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Carl Gollivan, domain reference and idealiveson.net. Question whether peace is an ultimate objective and even global economic sustainability and equilibrium rather than just growth can be achieved through monetary integrity. When those who labor are paid in an honest unit of account, people prosper, and historically that was recognized as gold and silver coin, which of course we've abandoned our obligations under Bretton Woods to maintain the dollar as redeemable in gold. Is there a potential for a new Bretton Woods meeting, perhaps someplace neutral like Reykjavik, where the nations could meet and consider restoring an honest gold monetary unit of account, which no longer is limited in its viability by the low velocity at which a gold coin would travel. Wireless technology, a company like Apple could have a private label monetary unit redeemable digitally in gold or physically, perhaps at an Apple store. So, thank you.
In general, innovation is really the heartblood of how the financial system comes together, and so we want to encourage that, whether that is in in a distributed ledger, which is the technology concept underneath some of that. We want to find ways that that can happen. On the other hand, the danger from money laundering, from terrorism activities, and so on, is a pervasive problem that we have to avoid, stop, and block, and fight back against as a core part of our values and of our future. So let me leave it with that. As I described in my remarks, dependable money is an important step in growth and investment for countries around the world. And so I think that's an objective that we can aspire to and promote. I note today Venezuela is running a 13,000% inflation rate, which, if you think about the impact of that on poor people within Venezuela, remember what happens when there's a high inflation rate. Wealthier people are protected, poorer people lose their even the food in their refrigerator because of the inflation taking away their value. It's a desperate situation that we all should be working to avoid. So I'm interested in all kinds of ideas on innovation, but I think from the standpoint of what principles can we put forward, and I think Jack Kemp was part of this. Having money that's dependable over long periods of time is a splendid is a goal that we can aspire to. Thanks.
Yes. What? Okay, Warren, go ahead. We'll
Warren Coates, retired from the International Monetary Fund. As the U.S. and Europe and hopefully the rest of the world's economies grow in the coming years, as we expect and hope, the demand for an international reserve asset will also grow. And if it continues to be supplied by the United States in the form of the U.S. dollar, this requires a continued balance of payments deficit on the U.S. part in order to supply those dollars. The SDR of the International Monetary Fund was meant to supplement dollars in international reserves to relieve that pressure, but the IMF has been very resistant to promoting it in any way, such as encouraging the World Bank and other international development agencies to borrow in SDRs, denominating globally traded commodities like oil, et cetera, in SDRs, things that would encourage the development of a private infrastructure in SDR assets that would be necessary. The IMF has been very resistant to promoting any of that because they felt a cold wind from the U.S. Treasury.
Is there a question?
The question is, in light of the need for a balance of payments deficit on the part of the U.S. to supply these reserves, will you consider giving the IMF a green light and encouraging them to promote a larger role for the SDR?
I don't agree with the economics that you postulated in the question, so I don't see that there is a need to address that through SDRs.
Rick Kessler. Since Bill Roth and Jack Kemp and my old boss Bill Frenzel were all on my board at Ripon at the same time in those days, my question is this, David. How do we get the global institutions, some of which you named, how do we get them also to allow U.S. products and services abroad to have a chance to showcase? Example, MCC, we give tremendous amount of money. Many U.S. companies are actually stopped right at the border from ever participating in those contracts. We see this time and time again. I saw one recent development at the UN where a U.S. firm actually got a master agreement. But we see almost everywhere I travel around the world, countries go in and leverage their aid economic help with also showcasing their national product lines. The United States just doesn't do that. And given that I come from sort of the congressional side, which is the constituent services side, how do we get those global institutions to better promote U.S. products and services in a much fairer, competitive playing field?
I would phrase that a little differently of how do we create a level playing field for American businesses so that they can compete within the contracting opportunities that are out there. One of the most unbalancing effects that's going on today is China's export credit agencies and also its state-owned banks. So China's operating a very government-controlled, government-centric system that makes non-market loans into countries and has non-transparent terms that end up causing China to have the best shot at getting all of the business from those behaviors. So we're pushing back on that in a number of international fora to try to achieve a level playing field for U.S. products and services in those. Another aspect of this is simply to have less of the world economy controlled by governments and more of it by private sectors, which would be a key way to give U.S. businesses a fairer shake. And another is on the corruption front, and I've spoken in some of my speeches on this, that to have standards be more transparent so that U.S. companies can fully participate in that. A lot of times the U.S. companies are being held to a higher standard than other countries do with their own companies, and so that creates also an unlevel playing field. So there's 3 ways that we can do that, and it fits well into the America First concept that Steve mentioned early on. How do we create a fair shake for American workers? Thanks.
Yep. Over on this side, I've been neglecting my left for some reason. I don't know why.
Thank you. It's Dana Marsh with Transnational Strategy Group. And David, thank you very much for that. Along with the challenges that we have with China on trade and on inbound investment, another challenge, it seems, is on their enormous infrastructure development activities abroad. We've seen recent thinking, both the administration, in fact, administration proposal on the DFI, the Development Finance Institution, for fiscal 19, and a very intriguing idea that reportedly the Australian Prime Minister is bringing of a quadrilateral sort of a lash-up providing development finance money that might help companies from those 4 countries. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about administrations thinking about those schemes or others to try to be able to put a U.S. flag in that important space. Thank you.
In a way, thank you for the question. The answer is going to be similar to the one I just gave, that that the best way to have an attractive environment for U.S. companies is often going to be to have less governments occupying the space. And so I'm hesitant to think of U.S. development finance through the U.S. government as a solution to the problem. A better solution, I think, is to persuade China to abide by more coherent rules in terms of their own financial loans. They're piling debt onto countries that, and the debt, remember, goes to the existing government of a country, and then that existing government benefits, and then they're gone, and the country is left with the debt for years and years and years. And so it ends up being a burden rather than a benefit. And so I think I want to stick with that approach as a way to encourage global growth and benefit American workers.
Now, just one thing, if I could ask on China, because you have mentioned that a number of times. The plan seems to be in stone, totally resistant to to what you're talking about. Is there any indication that there's movement or progress along the lines that you're thinking of, David?
One of the challenges for the world is that as China has grown, then and decided not to move toward market orientation, that means the misallocation of capital actually increases as a percentage of the world. You've got this giant capital allocator, China, choosing its investments in non-market ways. So that actually ends up depressing or slowing world growth. So I think that's something that the world can come together on and realize that that's a drag on the world. So as that discussion occurs, China hears that more and more. You know, we're coming off of a period of years where China was congratulated by the US, by other countries for whatever they were doing. They went to Davos a year ago and said, we're into trade, when in reality, what they were doing was perpetuating and continuing a system that worked for their benefit, but ended up costing jobs in most of the rest of the world. And so reorienting that discussion, I think, will at least make clear to the world where the different points of view on freedom and on economics, on growth, what are the different positions on that. China's in one camp, kind of alone in that, and the rest of the world is standing saying, we really don't want to go in that direction. We want to go in a better way. Okay.
I have a question over here. The gentleman in the red tie, who I
Thank you,
missed
Steve.
a couple of times.
A question first for Mr. Malpass. Your office would seem to be a logical one to which other international affairs officials of countries would come for advice on tax cuts. After the 81 tax cuts and the 86 cuts, many countries adopted very, very similar approaches to keep up with the United States. I'm glad to see Christine Lagarde is bothered by that, but do you see other evidence of countries moving in this direction? And I have one more academic question after that, and that is this. Shouldn't we be talking in terms of the development of economic growth as changes in relative prices? Obviously, taxes change relative prices, as does deregulation. Thank you.
Yeah, to the second point, we could think of it as a wedge. If we think of a tax wedge, Europe, it runs a big tax wedge on labor. The labor is loaded up with taxes, and we can observe that the unemployment rate there tends to be higher than in countries that don't have such a wedge. And the same could be said of regulatory policy, creating a wedge between the price that the buyer feels and the profit or the price that the seller benefits from. And so that's certainly a way to think about those. As far as the tax regimes, I guess I would, you know, people around the world talk about policies, but when you really get to it, a lot of it is national and is local. The dialogue is going to be different in the US than it will be in France, than it will be in Canada, because our governmental systems are so different. So I guess my thought would be that we should broaden it to structural reforms. So if each country had an internal dialogue about what's the best policy changes that would allow median income to go up, and then they proceeded to try hard to get that policy passed in their own country, that would be good for them. That would end up being good for American workers as well, because we'd have a faster growing world. And it really is going to be different. Some countries have labor immobility where they can't hire the workers that they really need to hire. Other countries have, you know, there are some countries that have a very expensive legal stamp that has to go on all documents. You might think, hasn't those days gone gone. A notary of the public in the US is a relatively inexpensive concept, but in some other countries it's very expensive, and you have to wait in line in order to get the document so that you can have property rights, so that you can have a bill of sale and things like that. And so that, for those countries, that might be the single biggest thing that would allow faster growth. And so I come back to a point I made earlier, that in a lot of cases we could wonder, why does that happen? And when you really dig into it, the governments have a vested interest in keeping the status quo, which is often that big wedge that we were talking about on that causes costs to be much higher than the benefit. So if we could change that, we could get faster growth abroad, faster growth in the US. Thanks. We better.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jimmy, you want to?
So before we thank Undersecretary Malpass and Steve, David, you love ideas. The folks in our Kemp network and here today, they've got a lot of ideas. How do you want to take in ideas from the people who care and want what you just described to happen? What's the best way for people to interact?
Thanks, thanks, Jimmy. Public service is one way. In other words, get involved, that's one. Two is write articles as you do, as your colleagues do. And those are read. People look at ideas and have an interaction with that. And then fora like this, I think are important for people to actually have an open discussion of ideas. Innovative, radical ideas. I'm sorry if anyone today I was brusque with, but in a way we have to hear ideas, react, move, pick some good ones and move on. I'm always looking for ideas, and I've laid out a little bit. Ones that raise median income, right. is a great one, and there are parts of the world where median incomes today are just plain too low, and right. So we're desperate for ways where we encourage and invite ways for countries to raise their median incomes. That way we'd have better markets for US products, we'd have a better life for people as we go into that. So those are some ideas.
I mean, it's not a fixed pie, it's the static growth as well.
Jack, that was Jack would start the speech. You can't think about a fixed pie, it's a growing pie, and so we can have win-win solutions all the time.
I heard that a few times. So we're gonna have a reception afterwards, so please stick around. Thank you all for coming. Before we close, I just wanna acknowledge a good friend of the Kemp family, somebody who would have loved to have been here and added a lot to the conversation. Jeff Bell, a dear friend, passed away just within the past couple of weeks. His funeral was yesterday, and our friend John Mueller, who was my dad's economist for a long time, wrote a piece calling Jeff a modern-day George Bailey. He was behind the scenes, but he made Jack Kemp, Ronald Reagan, he made their ideas become much greater because of his great work behind the scenes. And we're very grateful for the Jeff Bells of the world and all of you who care about the American idea. David, thank you for coming. Dr. Hanke, thank you for managing the conversation. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause.